Hello, everybody. You are now doing less once more with John and Jeff. Welcome back. It's been over 3 weeks since we recorded our last episode, and I want to come out and say now I'm at liberty to say we had some contract disputes, Jeff and I, to record these podcasts. So luckily we worked through that. Mostly it was because we heard that Joe Rogan's getting paid $100 million a year for his podcast.
John's ripping me off.
So we wanted to get back in on that action, and so we were able to yes, as Jeff said, tie up our contract disagreements.
Yeah, before he was keeping 100% of the profits, and now we're splitting it 50-50.
Yes.
It's still $0, in case you're
still zero. Now he owns half of the debt, and I own half the debt. But today we're going to be talking about there's a lot more stuff to talk about with regards to the coronavirus shutdown. The whole economy is just one big experiment right now. So we know you guys turned to Do Less to hear us weigh in on what should be happening in the economy, and so that's what we're going to be talking about today. Stuff that should be happening, stuff that we see that is happening, and stuff that people are talking about. The first one, kind of the first topic that we're going to be diving into is just the concept of stimulus, stimulating people, stimulating the citizens that are without work. And what does that mean for the long-term economic impact to a society? I'll just start by one of the things that made me start thinking about this was I saw a graph of the unemployment rate next to the credit card delinquency rate. So credit card payments 30 days outstanding or more. They move in lockstep ever since like before 2008, for the past over 10 years. Unemployment went up in 2008 and credit card delinquencies went up. And then as unemployment went down, credit card delinquencies moved down in parallel. And recently we've gotten a ginormous spike up in unemployment with no movement, with no change to credit card delinquencies. Credit card delinquencies are just as low as they were before any mention of coronavirus. So what does that mean? Does that mean there's a spike coming in credit card delinquencies, or did the Federal Reserve solve the problem of economic hardship? There's not going to be any delinquencies ever. We can just have massive unemployment without credit card delinquencies as long as people spend as long as people get their stimulus checks. So that's something that's definitely I'm keeping my eye on.
Yeah, if more people are unemployed, you should expect more people to miss their credit card payments. It just makes sense, right? And so maybe on face value, this seems like a good thing, right? So the credit card companies get paid what they're promised, and people get to keep their credit score up. Everyone's happy, right? But what we don't see is the unseen costs of the stimulus, right? So the question is, anytime the government spends money, they have to get that from somewhere. And so either they had to borrow the money, or they had to increase taxes, or they had to print the money. That's the only way they can pay, or they could have sold some of their assets. But our government doesn't really have any assets, so that's not really one of the options. But so they didn't increase taxes. We know that much. And in fact, tax revenue is most likely going to go down this year. It's certainly going to go down. It's not most likely. It's definitely going to go down. So obviously they had to borrow the money, and some of that borrowing is not. So some of that borrowing is not directly paid for by the Fed. Like the Fed's not printing money and just handing it to the government. What the government does is they borrow the money and then the Fed buys those bonds from the government, not directly, but in the secondary market. But that's kind of neither here nor there. Like their buying of the bonds in the secondary market is going to affect their price on the primary market. But so again, back to the question is, okay, we issued the stimulus, no harm done, right? No harm, no foul. Looks like, unemployment went up, but people got to pay their credit cards, et cetera, et cetera. But again, so these costs, these stimulus things, these are I think, in my opinion, long-term costs, right? So either we're going to pay down this debt or we're just going to keep printing money until we essentially default on the debt by making the money we owed worth much less. And so over a long period of time, we're either going to pay more in taxes than we would have gotten from these stimulus checks because debt accrues interest, or the value of our savings is going to decrease more than the money we got from these stimulus checks. So in the long run, you can basically say with pretty much certainty that the amount of value citizens got from this stimulus is going to be less than the long-term costs to pay for it. So when you think about it, it's like basically the government is forcing us to, because you don't really get a choice whether you get the stimulus. Like they're going to hand it out. And so obviously you might as well take it. But all they've done is just basically they've taken a loan out of your future to give you money now in your present. And maybe for some people that's in their interest, but maybe for a lot of people it's actually not in their interest. Maybe people are going to come down on harder times in the future. You don't know. And so it's just, they're just kind of picking and choosing what's the best for us without, our permission.
Yeah. I want to kind of take that and apply it to what I think people should think about government spending as. So you're kind of mentioning the concept of future ability or future amount to be able to spend versus the amount of it being able to spend today. That concept is like return of being able to spend more in the future than you are today. And when you're talking about return, you're talking about investing. Like investing properly is like if you're a good investor, it means you can spend more tomorrow. Like you're foregoing spending today. You're picking the best avenue to return capital, and you'll be able to spend more tomorrow. And I think this is critical for thinking about government. And I don't hear this conversation a lot, so maybe this is a hot take for Do Less podcast listeners. But I think that government spending should be thought of primarily as an investment, right? The government, because if modern monetary theorists have anything going for them, right? They said that after 2008 it wasn't going to be inflationary. They said the government could basically print as much money as they want, because the dollar is not going to devalue or they can print as much as they want, and they're not going to default on their obligations because they can just print more. They do understand that eventually you're going to lose purchasing power through inflation, but they say at that point you can just you can increase taxes and then that'll curb inflation. So that's kind of the basis of their argument, but it's completely disregarding the concept of when you're spending. It's different to place money in non-returning avenues than it is to put it into returning avenues, right? I would actually almost agree with modern monetary theorists if they said, our theory only works if you get 10% return on your spending. The government, the government spending, even though yes, it is spending like you and I would spend for like a contract on a bridge or like a public works project, just as you and I would buy a new window for our house or a new driveway service, right? It's all contracts that are spent into there's you're providing the funding for that contract. The government is providing the funding, but to think of it as just spending and then that's it. That the money is spent, now it's in the economy. That's all the conversation needs to include.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the conversation needs to include the return,
Right.
If you build a bridge that crumbles and is not useful in a year from now, well, then you just essentially burn that money,
Mm-hmm.
which is a lot different than putting money into the economy through, say, a bridge that's sturdy and useful, and people are willing to pay tolls to go over the bridge. And after 10 years, you actually return a positive return on that bridge, right? The government can actually do that. That's actually what the government should be doing. It should be acting as a smart public investor, investing in things that's going to make the public better off. It's going to return real, money, real value to the government, and it's going to be able, and then taking out debt or issuing debt as the government does to create to create the public, contract. It's actually everyone's better off because of that, which is a lot different than burning the money.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, they're right in that the monetary people, they're right in the sense that there's a trade-off between taxation, debt, and inflation. Like, they're all essentially part of the same picture. But what I think they fail to understand is that there's a difference between money and wealth. They look at it as like, okay, the government spent the money, so the money's back in the economy, and then it can go spent on other things. And as long as there's like this amount of money going around, no harm done. Like, it's the same amount of wealth in the pool. It's like, no. Money is not the same as wealth. You can have the same level of money or a lower level of money or a higher level of money. And it's completely irrelevant to the amount of wealth that's in your country. Wealth is real stuff. It's things like houses, running water, electricity, food, cars. That's wealth. That's real standard of living. That's what we really want at the end of the day. And if you take all the money earned by people producing real wealth and then you spent it on, digging a bunch of ditches, you've just replaced all the real wealth with a bunch of ditches. So it's like, yeah, the same amount of money is there, but now since you spent all the money on unproductive things versus productive things, then the next year, once everyone takes their paycheck from digging all those ditches, there's nothing to spend it on because the only thing you produced in that year was ditches. So it's not that you can't just equate all spending because it's not the same, right? You can't just spend money and say, okay, it's just spending. It's in this aggregate of spending and it's all the same. It's like not all spending is created equal. Not all investment is created equal. There's good investments, there's bad investments. You can't just aggregate them and call this, some variable I and put it in the GDP. It doesn't work that way.
Right.
So I think that's where their theory has a fault in its core assumptions. And another place I would say is they're right that, as inflation rises, you can increase taxes and decrease, debt, and then that will that will fight the inflation. But there is no working real model for predicting inflation. So, like, what if you inflate your way into like a hole you can't get out of? If inflation gets too out of control, it may be the case you actually cannot collect enough tax revenue because there is a limit to how much tax revenue you can get. Like, you can increase the rate as much as you want, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to increase the revenue. And so there's a limit to how much revenue you can get. And if you dig yourself into a big enough hole, taxation can't necessarily cover the amount of inflation you've already created. And so there's no way to predict that beforehand. So I think that's a dangerous game they're playing with that. And on the top of inflation, I think people really, really, really underestimate how how much inflation takes from us. And so, John, you sent me this interesting index that is an alternative to the CPI. It's done by a private research group. It's called the Chapwood Index, and essentially they just have their own method of measuring inflation, in which they take the top 500 items that people use their disposable income on each year, and then look at the top 50 cities in terms of population, I guess, or size, however that's measured, and then they just look at they don't do any adjustments or anything. They just look at the price of those, top 500 items unadjusted, and then just measure the change of that basket year over year. And that seems like, on its face, a decent way of measuring inflation. There's probably flaws in that, but there's going to be flaws in any way of measuring general price level, because as a concept, it's flawed to begin with. So it's always going to have issues. But, seems like a perfectly reasonable way to measure it. And yet they're coming up with inflation rates of like 10% per year for the past 5 years in almost every major city in America. And to give you some context, if there's inflation at 10% per year over 5 years, over that 5-year span, any cash you have sitting in your bank account will have lost 45% of its purchasing power over that 5-year period. So you're basically every 5 years losing half of your wealth to inflation, if that's the true level of inflation, which I'm not saying it is, but it seems like a legitimate way to measure it. And, if it's anywhere near that wheelhouse, that's a pretty astounding amount of your wealth that you're losing constantly to inflation. So it really should not be underestimated how destructive inflation can be to our wealth as a nation.
Yeah, I really like the Chapwood Index. I think that's really a breath of fresh air to this conversation, because really the holy grail for modern monetary theorists is like, inflation is your limiter. Inflation is the limiting factor. So you do whatever you want. It's modern monetary theory. So it's like we live in this age of digital. You can print money digitally, and there's no such thing as like, oh, we ran out of the ability to provide these resources to people. We're only limited by the stuff we can think of to spend it on. It's like modern. It's like that's modern monetary theory. As long as like people are unemployed, you can keep spending. You can keep creating money and buying things until everybody's until full employment, right? Mm-hmm. And they say, yeah, okay, there is a drawback. Like if you start to see inflation, then you gotta cut it back a little bit. But the CPI has been so low for so long. Like even look at Japan. Like Japan has had deflation, even with the Bank of Japan printing so much money and government absorbing so many facets of or sectors of their economy. So it's like if Japan can like fully undergo modern monetary theory, and they don't even see any inflation, they see deflation, right? We've got all this space to run with, but that's just like taking the CPI as like this golden, law, like this inherent truth to an economy. It's like we've talked about this on this podcast. Mm-hmm. The CPI is garbage. Like, it's not even like like the CPI tracks a fixed basket of goods price, and they change the basket. Like that's inherently like different than what the CPI is supposed to be. So that's why this Chapwood Index is really refreshing, because it's like it's public. All of it is like the information is not hidden. It's just like, here are the goods we're looking at. 500 things that you can buy in these cities, average prices, and then we'll track it over time. It's like they, on average, go up 10% here, 8% here, 12% there. It's like specifically what we actually said on this podcast. But like it's different for Tulsa,
right?
Than it is for New York. So It's like You got to be able to track that different. Like you got to have some kind of ability to create a difference between those metrics, not just one beautiful perfect number that comes out. This is the CPI. Look, it's below 2. Keep printing. Like there you go.
Yeah.
Wheels up, keep printing. Inflation's below 2. Even inflation above 2, it's like, okay, symmetric inflation, keep going. They'll never stop. Like you need something to reel them back in. It's like, well, what are you trying to measure? Prices? Oh, prices, they're going up. Look at the Chapwood index. So it's like, it's just really, I think it's really an advancement to this conversation because it's like, I could talk for hours about the theoretical, it's basic supply and demand. It's go back to Econ 101, if you print money and you engage in a market where there was otherwise no printed money, the supply and demand is going to clear the market at a certain price, right? It's going to find its equilibrium. You add money, you're adding demand. Added demand is a higher price. Like it's just basic economics. Simple. Like every dollar that's printed is necessarily demand that didn't exist, and therefore prices are theoretically going. But you can't just talk that way when you're talking about these like advanced macroeconomic, modern monetary theorists, because they're like, no, we got all these metrics. You got CPI. It's like, okay, well, prices, they are going up. Look at the Chapwood index.
Right. Yeah, and that's like the thing is like they have their CPI measure and they think it's like so infallible that like they're not even considering other ways of looking at it. But it's like if inflation is that high, 10%, that's astounding, right? That's really high levels of inflation. And honestly, to me, that seems like more accurate. That seems like a more accurate representation of how much we're getting screwed by inflation. But let's say even if let's say the Chapwood index came back at 0% for the past 5 years. That doesn't mean it's okay to keep printing money. Just because there's no inflation in consumer goods or whatever doesn't mean there's zero consequences to printing money, right? So if people have savings, that savings came from real production, real value. They, whatever you want it to be. Like, so let's say you needed a plumber and they came in and they plumbed it and you paid them. That money that is sitting in that plumber's bank account represents real value of fixing your house and maintaining its running water. Okay. So that's real wealth that's been added. Okay. Now, if other people want to go out and experiment and take risks and the WeWork guy wants to borrow some money to go do his crazy idea for a company, he has to go to the market in a free market and ask all the people who have proven themselves with and produced real wealth and have those savings in their bank account. And he has to ask them, can I please borrow some of this money for this idea I have? And those people are going to say, maybe, yes, no, doesn't matter. But there's going to be a price, and that price is going to be based on how much savings there is available and how good these ideas are for investment. And that's going to be the market rate of interest, okay? And if there's a lot of savings, it'll be low. But if there's not a lot of savings, it'll be pretty high. But if the Fed now comes in and becomes a lender at a lower interest rate than what the market has determined, then everyone who's saved and produced real wealth is getting screwed out of their opportunity to be a lender. Value they could have gotten as a lender because of their savings that they deserve is now being taken away from them because the Fed can offer it at a cheaper rate. So essentially what you've done is you've transferred wealth away from savers to borrowers by manipulating the rate of interest. So you don't even have to take a look at inflation to see there are repercussions to manipulating interest rates or printing money. And so this has negative consequences, right? So like I've said this before, I think if you had roughly 10 grand and you invested at if you managed to get a 30-year CD at 10% interest, that would be like 200 grand by the time you got your money back. Versus at 5%, you get like 20 grand by the time your money. So it's like a huge, huge difference in the total wealth accumulation that you would have by the end of that 30 years. So this is like a huge wealth transfer from savers to borrowers. And why are we doing that? What is the I've yet to see a single justification as to why we should be transferring wealth away from people who save to people who borrow. That doesn't make any sense to me.
Right. That's the effect of printing money. And more broadly, inflation's effect on the economy. It's really backwards the way our country's economists are. Economists in the world believe that inflation is necessary in a healthy economy. Like, you can have inflation that's too low. Well, not only is that so bizarre, because inflation is actually the product of a healthy or ill economy. You could have a healthy economy with deflation. You could have a healthy economy with inflation. You could have a sick economy with inflation. You could have a sick economy with deflation.
Right.
So right off the bat, hearing that, you should be able to say, "Oh, I can't make decisions off the inflation as a metric."
Right.
Like, it's not enough information. It itself is a product of an underlying deeper root cause. So right off the bat, it's just goofy to make policy while watching inflation. But the government does do that. The Federal Reserve does do that. And not only do they make the policy on it, as I said, they want higher inflation. They see inflation that's too low and they want to change that, right? And this is one of the biggest scams that that we've fallen for, that we were able to be convinced, that our economists were able to be convinced that this is a thing. Mm-hmm. The government, you have to understand, has a vested interest in this whole situation, because the government is the biggest borrower. So the government wants inflation is always better when inflation is larger. Any entity that's a large borrower is always going to benefit when the debt to be repaid is cheaper to repay when they have to repay it than it was when they took out the lending. So you can kind of think of it in a different way of putting it, is that the government is like always inherently short dollars when they borrow dollars. And then, as Jeff was saying, it transfers wealth from savers to borrowers. Well, it also transfers wealth from those that are long dollars to those that are short dollars. So again, the government is like the largest short entity of dollars in the whole world. The U.S. government is. And then who's long dollars, right? You could think,
anyone with a bank account.
Yeah. So and more so is, you might think if you're long dollars, like who is really long dollars? You might think, someone in the 1%, like a billionaire, is like long dollars. But in actuality, a billionaire is actually shorter dollars than a middle class, earner. Mm-hmm. Like a middle income earner is actually longer dollars as a proportion of their net wealth than a billionaire is. Like almost
much
always.
Much more.
Yeah. So, because when you think about it, like someone who depends on their salary to live, right? They're essentially agreeing to a annuity agreement. Right? Annuity is just like an agreement to be paid a fixed amount of money in like a fixed period. Right, so a salary is just an annuity, right? So in exchange for an annuity, I'm going to offer my time, skills, my work, that as a salaried employee. So when I make that agreement, which most middle class earners do, they are signing a agreement that is making them extremely long dollars with respect to their net worth. Like, they need the dollar to maintain value, because they need the dollars that they receive in the future to go as far as they think they will at the time of signing the contract, right? A billionaire it's not the case. Like when you talk about a billionaire salary, it's almost like irrelevant. Like I think Jeff Bezos is like has a salary at Amazon, the company he owns, of like 70K.
Yeah, it's somewhere around there.
Yeah, not to like balk at that. I mean, that's a good salary for like any middle income earner. But to Jeff Bezos, that's laughable. Like he doesn't care about this. Like the salary is probably just for accounting purposes. Like it's just like a tax thing. Like just like a stupid loophole or something they're trying to. Like his salary, if you will, his income is his capital gains that he gets on the company he owns. The assets that are, under his name in ownership under the law. Like that's his, and that's not, so he has ownership of assets has nothing to do with dollars. That's a real, like Jeff was saying, that's a real asset, and that could be real wealth if the company is managed properly. So he, as a proportion to his wealth, Jeff Bezos is much shorter dollars, or like less long dollars than say, a minimum wage worker at McDonald's or something. You know what I mean? So, the wealth is being shifted from the long dollars, middle income earners, to the less long dollars, billionaires.
Right.
Which is just,
you can think of like inflation as essentially flattening the distribution of how long or short people are of the dollar, where it's extracting wealth from the people who are extremely long the dollar, people who are extremely short the dollar. And so like it's essentially like the most regressive tax you could ever invent. It takes the majority of the wealth from lower income people to pay for government, and much less of the wealth from upper income people. So like the inflation is probably, in my opinion, the biggest culprit to wealth inequality in this country. And I don't think enough people are acknowledging this. If anyone at all.
Yeah. So all this stuff that we're saying, it's kind of in response to this tweet that Paul Krugman tweeted out this week. Who Krugman is, if not familiar, he's not really a modern monetary theorist. I mean, in name, in my opinion, it doesn't really matter. Like
names are like useful to an extent, but it's like they have limits.
Economists get so caught up with names, like like neoliberalism or Keynesianism, modern monetary theory. Like it's all just like you got to learn these stratum to understand like what someone's even talking about before you even like hear what they're saying, because like people like identify with these classes of economists. But he's what's considered like a Keynesian, which is, I mean, I guess the biggest difference between that and modern monetary theory is Keynesianism is like, it's like stimulus is the, Keynesianism is focusing on the trade-off between stimulus and growth, economic growth, kind of.
Well, I would say Keynesian and modern monetary theory both have the same central premise, in that they think if there is unemployment, they see that as like slack in our productive capacity, and they think that can be fixed by a central planner. Whereas in Keynesianism, it's the government that should spend the money to fix the problem, and they get that through taxes or debt. Whereas the modern monetary people would say just print the money, employ people to do stuff.
Yeah,
and that's really the only difference, I think.
Right, that's a good distinction. Yeah, like Keynesianism is like debt is sometimes good. Like sometimes you want more and more debt, whereas modern monetary theory is like don't even think about the debt. Like that's not even like a something, which is just it's kind of arbitrary. But yeah. Anyway, so Krugman's is a Nobel laureate Keynesian economist. And he tweeted this on May 22nd. Today is May 24th, by the way. We are recording this on Sunday afternoon. Paul Krugman said, repeat after me. Debt is money we owe to ourselves. It doesn't make the nation as a whole poorer. Right? So he's trying to dispel the myth that growing the national debt is a problem. Because the national debt, it's growing. If the national debt growing is a problem, we are screwed because it was a big deal when it hit 22 trillion, when it hit 23 trillion. I think it hit 24 trillion like 2 weeks ago, and then it's going to hit 25 trillion like next week.
No, I think it already passed 25.
Or it's already past 25. It's going to hit.
It's close
26,
to 26.
like,
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like exponential, or as Joe Biden would say, exponential, exponentially increasing.
You ain't black.
Yeah, you ain't right. Oh my gosh, that's just as absurd. But I don't think we'll go into that.
No, we don't need to get into that.
Yeah. So an economist who agrees with what the government is doing right now, but wants to maintain the public image that it's the right thing, might want to dispel the rumor that a growing debt is a problem, right? So he is shaking hands with the modern monetary theorists and saying, don't look at the debt. It's not a problem. He said, in fact, it's money we owe ourselves. So it's irrelevant. It's just a balance sheet. It's just a balance sheet mechanics, It's not actually any boding sign or of bad or a problem. It's just, I don't even know. It's not an issue in his opinion.
Right.
But we're really going into in this podcast the fact that it is an issue if that debt is created with no recourse to be able to pay it off. Then an exponential increase, you have to be looking for, okay, where's the exponential increase in tax receipts?
Right.
Right. If you can show that, then it's like, okay, yeah, I see. It's not an issue. If you can't show that, then it's just like you have to understand every single year, a larger portion of the national budget will be going to paying off the interest of the debt that's being accrued.
Right. Yeah. I mean, first things first, just the repeat after me. It's so obnoxious. Like, it's just like
hubris.
Yeah, it's just so condescending. It's like, oh, you're all just too stupid to even like get to the right conclusions. So just repeat after me. Right. Just do what I say. Okay, you're all too dumb to understand.
I have the Nobel Prize. You don't. So repeat after me.
Yeah, like,
and maybe you'll.
So obnoxious. And then he said, following that, says something completely ridiculous because debt is money spent on real stuff. And so that has to come from somewhere. Anything the government spends has to come from somewhere. We already talked about this. So it's like, if we're all just an aggregate, right? And we all just behave as an aggregate, and you write yourself an IOU, yeah, okay. If like that's not a real problem, right? If I just write myself a check for 10 grand, then yeah, that's not a real liability or a real asset for me because it's just a check I owe myself. But that's not how aggregates work, right? Like, if some people are paying more than others in taxes and some people are receiving more benefits than others, then it's not, you can't just cancel it out. Like, it's like, oh, it's just money we owe ourselves. It doesn't matter. Like, it's because we're not all the same person. We're all individuals. Like, it all affects us differently. And if we don't even if that debt isn't, like we said earlier on this podcast, having a return on investment, if that money spent does not have a return, then the only way we're going to be able to pay for it is with inflation or just a lower standard of living in the future because we're going to give a higher proportion of our wealth in taxes to the government. So, and we talked about how bad inflation can be. It should not be dismissed. And so it's just like, he's not even acknowledging any of these arguments. He's just saying, repeat after me. It's a non-issue. Don't worry about it. Don't even think about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's like the kind of analogy I would draw is like, you can say, as a country, when we accrue more debt, it's like, as a nation, we're no poorer than. Those kind of conclusions are like the kind of conclusion that you can say, oh, on average, Americans have almost one testicle. It's like, yeah, okay. You can look at these broad, averages and say, Uh, you know. What useful information did you glean from, you know, on average, the average American has almost one testicle. It's like you're completely missing the point of like what that's trying to study. Like if you're trying to do that study, you know,
Dude, yeah, that literally, like, this is like what central planners do. They go, on average, an American has less than one testicle. Therefore, we must give each American 1.5 testicles to to make sure we're
to cover the gap. Yeah. Right. So it's just like when you're trying to measure something for a direct reason, right? An economist is trying to measure wealth to try to make everyone, wealthier, which is it's a almost like um, like that goal in itself is kind of goofy. Like economists just like, okay, it's up to us to make everyone better off. We're taking it upon ourselves. Um, so, but leaving that aside, it's just if you're trying to study that and you're using things like on average, when we accrue debt, that's just one citizen owing some other citizen. Thus, we're no, as a country, we're no richer or poorer. It's just like that's completely off base. Like,
right.
Well,
It's also just like it's so obnoxious because they don't have skin in the game, right? So they're not, the Federal Reserve creates the money. The government takes the money, right? Neither of them are putting any of their own personal, wealth into the game. And then they're making decisions for us and they don't pay any of the consequences. It's like, okay, you think people aren't wealthy enough? All right, go build a house with your money and give it to someone. That's wealth. That's real stuff. Like, go create a job and pay it out of your own pocket if you want more jobs, if you want unemployment to go down. Like, that's actually real, incremental additions to the wealth versus others. Like, these may make the numbers look better, but at the end of the day, it's not like they're overcomplicating it, right? Like, if you want less homeless people, we need more houses. If you want less hungry people, we need more food. And those aren't, it's not always as simple as just like, we need more farmers, because if more people go into farming, maybe we have less houses. That's the thing, is there's scarcity, there's trade-offs. And that's what economies try to figure out. They try to figure out how to best manage the scarce resources we have available. And so it's like, you can't just solve these problems by saying, I decree like no more unemployment. Like it's ridiculous on its face.
yeah. In fact, they have reverse skin in the game, like to what you're saying. If you work for the Federal Reserve and your goal is to like improve the economy, right? As a Federal Reserve employee, skin in the game would look something like any position you take in the market. Like if the Federal Reserve starts buying assets or being lent assets, I guess you could say, then you personally, as a Federal Reserve employee, would have a share of whatever you're buying or something. Like for example, like major hedge fund owners, if they have their own money in their own hedge fund, then you can say, oh, they want to do well, because if they don't, they're losing their own money. If a major hedge fund owner put their money in somewhere else and was managing others' money, you could say, why why don't you believe in what you're doing? Like you don't trust yourself to invest your own money. You only invest other people's money. Like that's kind of skin in the game. What the Federal Reserve does is they take on the toxic assets for the sake of economic improvement, which can be read as stock market stability and inflated stock market prices. When most of the Federal Reserve, probably every Federal Reserve employee, has stocks. Right? They're absorbing these toxic junk bonds and corporate debt and mortgage-backed securities that are probably worthless or not going to yield the return that the market would dictate. Therefore, it's like no one wants it. So the Federal Reserve takes it, injects the money that goes into the stock market. They don't have the assets that they're purchasing onto their balance sheet as a Federal Reserve, but they have the assets that are getting pumped up with the money that's created. It's just like that's like the reverse, and then well, obviously, what they're assuming onto their balance sheet is the taxpayer is liable for, especially with the special purpose vehicles that are uh, in their charter. They list the Treasury as the first loss responsibility. So if these special purpose vehicles that they're creating that are buying these junk corporate debt vehicles, if they go bankrupt, then the Treasury is the owner at that point. And the Treasury is just the ledger that's maintaining our tax flows. So it's like we're going to be paying the taxes to the same entity that's going to be holding toxic sludge assets. It's like just it's completely reverse. The Federal Reserve is in a position of completely reverse incentives, reverse skin in the game, in my opinion.
Yeah, and Argentina defaulted for like the sixth time or like the ninth time in their country's history recently. So, they're employing all these sorts of reckless policies that we're getting into more and more. And I know we have the reserve currency, and that's like supposedly makes us immune. It gives us invincibility, but I don't buy that. I don't buy that we can just do whatever the hell we want just because we have the reserve currency. Because the reserve currency is a status that was given to us. It's not like a birthright or anything special. Yeah. It's just people trust our currency more than others, but they won't if we're as bad as Argentina with our money. So there's no reason we can just maintain that reserve currency status if we're just continuing to be extremely reckless.
So I did want to address, one thing. So the thing about the national debt that people get scared about, it's like, okay, $26 trillion. You're talking about that sum. Like, how are we ever going to pay that off? Well, it's actually true. We don't have to pay it off. Like, in fact, if we paid it off, it actually wouldn't be, that wouldn't make any sense because the reason that people pay the government money or lend the government money, the $26 trillion that was lent to the government, is for the purpose of yielding. It's like every dollar that was lent to the government is a bond that will be repaid with interest. So and most Americans have retirement portfolios with bonds in them. So if we were to just pay them all off right now, then a lot of Americans, like, their retirements wouldn't. I think, in my opinion, they'll be safer getting paid off today than they would be if we see what happens in the coming years to the dollar. The dollars that will repay the bonds will probably be worth less in the future. But anyway, it's not a necessity. You don't have to pay off the $26 trillion of debt today, which makes people, modern monetary theorists want to say that the national debt is actually the national savings, because it's like that's the measure of the savings that were lent to the federal government. But yeah, just to address that, the benefit of having I'm trying to bring into the conversation about how the yield is constantly falling on treasuries. It's been falling for 30 years.
But yeah, like, I would say, like, the idea that bonds are just savings, while they are savings, for some, they're taxes to other people, right? That money doesn't just come from nowhere, right? So is it just that we basically have up young people coming into the workforce paying taxes on spending that they had no say in even creating? Like, it's debt is essentially taxing people who don't even get to vote on the issue. So honestly, in my opinion, I'd like to see a government that's not even allowed to issue debt. That'd be a place I like to live, honestly, because they'd have to get everything straight up. If they want to pay for something, just tax. That's the only way.
Yeah, I don't know if I mind government issuing debt just because um no, I mean I see what you're saying. Like there's no opportunity for perverse incentives without lending debt or
Right,
without creating debt.
because my opinion is just unless the debt is like five, even I mean even if it's a 5 year maturity on the debt, right? That's still like a 15-year-old is gonna have to, or let's say you're just 17, right? 1 year before you get to have a say in anything. That's still 4 years worth of debt that person has to pay that they had no say in the creation of. So it's just like, to me, on that margin, there's just winners and losers when you issue debt. Anytime you issue debt, I just feel like there's winners and losers.
The government issuing debt.
Yeah. Whereas, you know, if the tax base is essentially voting on the budget, then it's like everyone has skin in the game. It's like, all right, we can spend this, but if we're spending this, this is what we're gonna pay in taxes. So it's like everyone in that scenario has skin in the game, and like, you know, you can't just pass off the cost to a later generation and act like they don't exist, which is what we currently do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd like to see some kind of measure that doesn't exist that is like attempt to measure the actual return on government spending. Like take a government spend in a year. It's hard to do because like
I mean, it's
say, like
it's definitely negative.
It's definitely negative. But like say something like education, like we spent so many $1 billion on education this year, and then 15 years from now we have a very healthy staff of engineers, doctors,
right?
People that are
well. That's the thing is like
educated.
If any of this spending was net positive ROI, our debt would be going down.
Right.
It would be going in the other direction.
Yeah,
we'd be generating more tax revenue than we spent previously, but it doesn't. It only goes up.
Yeah, exactly. So like the measure that you would have to come up with would be the measure. Yeah, that difference between spend and tax revenues. And as we were saying earlier, the spend is going exponential, and the revenues are not.
I mean, the revenues can go exponential too if they just print a shitload of money, right? Like, but that's
right.
That's kind of what Venezuela did, and it didn't really work out for them. So, I mean, I don't think we want to repeat that. So, basically, we need to do less spending. We need to do less debt taken on of debt. What else do we need to do?
Do less money burning.
Yeah, money burning. Do less money printing. Actually, the Libertarians just nominated their nominee. Honestly, I don't actually know much about her. But in general, I read through her platform, and it involves doing less. So, I don't know. I guess I'll give her a shout out for that. But to be honest, I don't know too much about her.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to praise her yet, but I don't know. We could use a little bit of less in our lives.
A little bit less, yeah. I agree.
I did see though that she was tweeting the like caucus or the primary information, and it would be like Iowa caucus. It was like votes, and it would be like her 3, Hornberger 2, and like Vermin Supreme 1. So it's like in total like 6 people voted, which I don't know. It's like, I don't know, kind of sad but funny at the same time.
Yeah, just the fact that Vermin Supreme is like
he's like 20% of the Libertarian Party. For context, this is a guy who wears a boot on his head and wants to give everyone a pony. So yeah, I mean, I wouldn't consider myself a libertarian just because I don't like to put myself in groups. But I agree with a lot of their ideas. So, but I don't know. They definitely have a branding problem, and it's gonna be hard for anyone to ever take them seriously when like 20% of the party votes for a guy with a boot on his head. I get it. Like, it's satire, and I get it, but it's like, that's not the average person isn't gonna like respect that. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, you gotta pull votes from the mainstream.
Right.
You're not gonna do that if like some people think it's a joke.
Yeah, but I mean, it's sucks in my opinion because I think if there's ever an election for people to vote third party, I feel like this is it.
Yeah.
So I don't know. We'll see how it goes, but yeah, I don't like to attach myself to any because I think there's a lot of flaws with the Libertarian Party too, but I think that's like the closest to like their platform does the least, so they carry on the spirit I think the best.
All right. Well, I think that's good.
Yeah, keep doing less.
Keep doing less. See you next time.